So as I mentioned before, James A. Garfield will serve roughly 8 terms in Congress. A very fascinating 8 terms, to be quite honest with you, from the beginning of the Civil War all the way until he himself becomes a president. It's up and down. Let's just be 100% honest. It's up and down. It's one of those things that the more you look into presidents, people, historical figures, and you look at, every little minute details of an individual's life, you get a fascinating picture and a fascinating perspective, and you start looking at things and them a little differently. And I think you get to see the real people. You get to see the real human being that's underneath a lot of it, ultimately. And yet at the same time, you really don't see, the whole picture. And I think the individuals and the presidents that we end up seeing that whole picture from are the ones that we tend to endear the most in a lot of ways. I think Abraham Lincoln's one of those guys. I think Reagan, in a lot of ways, is one of those guys. Parts of, I think, Eisenhower, to a certain extent. There's a lot of them. Andrew Jackson, a whole bunch of them. And James Garfield's a tough cookie, though. His entire career in Congress is basically summed up, as I had previously noted in the previous episode, as a radical Republican. I understand that when he first came into political office, he ended up making a lot of good friends, specifically with Lincoln's cabinet. I would probably say certain members. Salmon P. Chase, basically, who was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury at that particular point in time. And, both of them would be considered the radical Republicans specifically. And while he was in Congress during Lincoln's presidency, he was basically just like, abolish slavery, do the whole Emancipation Proclamation and stuff like that. And while in Congress, he would always give speeches every now and then, basically pointing out the flaws within, conscription. And at that point, soldiers being drafted to basically go fight in the war. Effectively, I think he himself was calling upon hundreds of thousands to enlist, specifically, instead of forcing them to go fight, even though only 10,000. And that one's a finicky kind of thing. The sources on that are really all over the place. But for the most part, James A. Garfield effectively disliked Abraham Lincoln, disliked a lot of things about his presidency, begrudgingly, kind of voted for him, I guess you could say, despite, his personal negative antagonistic feelings towards him. And ultimately, during the Civil War time, was basically, in a lot of ways, as radical as it gets, but at the same time wasn't as radical overall in his entire career, and was just a very politically motivated Republican in a lot of ways. So what are his positions? I really do this with a lot of presidents. He's not necessarily consistent. He's consistent in a couple things, notably radicalism and radical republicanism, specifically of the, abolition type, yada yada, all that stuff. Unless it went to certain personal and particular instances where he has to step up to the plate outside of, Congress, et cetera, et cetera. He's usually pretty consistent about that. Punishing the South, which I'll get to when I get to his career during the Reconstruction period. I think interestingly enough, he's backs the gold standard, which I think is really fascinating. I mean, then again, back then it seems pretty logical. Again, I'm no economist, but I think just fiat paper money isn't a very financially prudent idea, because you can only give out so much credit before someone has to pay for it. Exactly. Anyways, he's basically voting for basically a gold standard, except the one time during the war itself when they actually had to suspend payment of gold and silver during the Civil War instead. His time during Abraham Lincoln's term is basically just that. Relatively speaking, antagonistic towards Abraham Lincoln. A lot of the things, he kept pushing for Abraham Lincoln to do the Emancipation Proclamation, a whole bunch of different things. He really cozied up with his cabinet for the most part. He ends up getting really close to his Secretary of Treasury, Salmon P. Chase. Both basically, ideologically speaking, I guess you could say, radical Republicans within the party itself. And when Abraham Lincoln dies, and the Republican Party is trying to find a new face, they're trying to figure some shit out for the most part. Pardon my language. A lot of people turn to the well-known faces. Ulysses S. Grant, who's a little apprehensive. He's still in the military. He's not trying to get into politics, and the Republicans are in a bit of a turmoil. And James A. Garfield, in certain facets, you could argue, had a prominent position. It sounds bad, but I guess my personal view is in today's politics, I guess you could say he's kind of like Josh Hawley, the Missouri senator, but not necessarily specifically Josh Hawley, but more just so in terms of stature, in terms of he's kind of there. People know who he is, and he has a political future for the most part, which I think is really interesting. So, what happens during the time of Reconstruction for young James A. Garfield, who, by the way, is basically in his mid-30s and a prominent House of Representative politician, also a part-time lawyer, too, in the state of Ohio, whenever he gets a chance, just in the off-season for the most part. He's interesting, to be quite honest with you. In the early goings, he's really radical. He's basically, let's, black suffrage, let's do all this stuff, but then what I know about him is that he is one of the few politicians that really learns the game and learns the machinations in a lot of ways. It sounds bad, but he's kind of like the Henry Clay a little bit, where he's just like, okay, so if I do this, I can maneuver this way, yada yada yada, which is going to be very interesting when it comes to his political future, which I'll either detail in this episode or the next episode. James A. Garfield, though, initially was a radical Republican during the 3-4 years of Reconstruction, primarily during Andrew Johnson's presidency specifically. But it's during this time, too, that he starts shifting. He starts looking at things in a different perspective and starts voting and really pushing for, surprisingly, much more moderate Republican ideals and policies, basically. He goes from basically hey, we're gonna punish all the Southern leaders, yada yada, and the people who fought against us, yada yada, during the war. To basically, I've come to the realization that if we keep doing this and punishing the South, that they're gonna have more people in Congress, and then we're gonna have no power whatsoever. So we should probably try and find some middle ground, and that's kind of where his head is at. I think in a lot of ways, for the most part, during this particular point in time during Andrew Johnson's presidency. Now, his relationship with Andrew Johnson's a really complicated one. He's not the biggest fan of Andrew Johnson. I think he wanted to give him a chance more so than anything else. It wasn't really anything. It was one of those situations where it's like, he's going to be here for 3 years, at the very least 4 years. So we should probably try and make things work. And if he's going to do the things that, Lincoln was going to do, then so be it. Let's give some reparations, yada yada. Let's do things that are actually going to be prudent for, America and black people in the suffrage in the South. But then, Johnson kind of goes a little bit haywire. He starts doing things his own way. It's not necessarily messes up Reconstruction. He just doesn't do it, in Abraham Lincoln's ideal, or at the very least is very loose with the actual rules and restrictions of what the actual initial Reconstruction plan was supposed to be for the Republicans and for the South. And ultimately, James A. Garfield's basically put in a corner, and he's like, God damn it, you fucking... I think at one point he calls him he's either dumb or a drunk, and, things like that. It's funny, because back then, today we think politics is kind of crazy, but, during this time, and for a long time, it's they're pretty lit with their verbiage and their insults with how they communicate with one another in politics. It's really interesting. But basically, anyways, he basically goes from radical Republican to a moderate Republican, back to a radical Republican during Andrew Johnson's presidency within basically 3 years. And he's going against Andrew Johnson, voting in favor begrudgingly for a lot of the things, the Office and Tenure Act, and eventually for the impeachment of Andrew Johnson when it comes around in 1868, 1869, around that particular point in time. And, it's one of those things that, he was going to vote. Politics ultimately really pushed him I think more so than anything else. And it wasn't that he was a weak politician. Let me make this very clear. It was much more so that, there's certain things. It's tough. I think he's playing both fields and both sides, and also doing things that work out in his favor, both politically and personally. Like, there are people who vote for things that are just purely on principle, and then there's people who, they might gain something out of it, or they might not lose something if they vote in a particular way. And James Lee Garfield was very keenly aware of it all. Because you have to understand, by 1868, 1869, when he's becoming, a future 40-year-old man or a 40-year-old man by this particular point in time, he's on a whole bunch of different committees. He held various positions. I mean, at one point he's the chairman of the Banking and Currency Committee, the Appropriations Committee, the Military Affairs Committee. He's also a member of the House and Ways, the big House Ways and Means Committee. And around this particular time, Black Friday, September 24th, 1869. Got the date right. He basically was able to investigate the allegations and basically catch Jay Gould, who's trying to fix the gold market, which actually resulted in the Black Friday scandal of September 24th, 1869. And ultimately, because of that, it actually snagged him the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, specifically. I mean, Garfield basically, within 4 years of Abraham Lincoln's death to the beginning of Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, is ahead of one of the two most important congressional committees. He has a lot of influence. He has a lot of power, and people acknowledge that. So I just want to make that very clear. He's, within 5-6 years, a very prominent and popular and overwhelmingly powerful and influential politician. So, Garfield, though, what are other policies and things that are going around and going all along around this particular point in time? What's basically going to be who he is for the next couple of years? Really interesting. First and foremost, like I said before, gold standard. He's always going to be that. Eastern Republicans specifically loved him. A lot of these Eastern Republicans tended to be, they're known as gold bugs. Basically, these are wholesalers, bankers, lenders, for the most part, that they just didn't want the dollar to be devalued. If you give someone a certain amount of paper money, they didn't want it, the same paper money, but to be devalued when they got it back. Little things like that. And for him, he feared three things, which I'll basically get into. He hated labor unions, he hated communism, and he hated a poor economy. Let me get with the poor economy first. Poor economy, above all else, ultimately is basically just the big thing for him. For the most part, he's on like 15 different committees for poop's sake. He's just doing everything he possibly can in order to reduce economic stagnation in every sense of the word. He'd be back and forth, to be quite honest with you, when it comes to the Gilded Age, in terms of allowing corporations, etc., because he also doesn't want power to be taken control. He doesn't want communism by any stretch of the imagination. So, but he doesn't want big businesses to take over, but he also doesn't want the economy. He's going to be moderate, effectively, for periods of time. Basically, from this point on, where it becomes very advantageous to become a moderate Republican. Anyways, communism. Communism is a thing that's actually going to occur around this particular point in time. Because you have to understand, co-op farms are starting to occur, specifically by the Granger laws, little things like that, who basically are going to just communes, effectively, of farmers for the most part. He's just like, ooh, it's communism in disguise, in his own words. That's what he said, by the way, and specifically just disliked it in any meaningful way. He also hated labor unions, another guise of communism, etc., all people coming together, the working man, no individualism, etc. He did not like the 8-hour workday, and he actually believed in sending in federal troops to break up strikes, which I'm very curious to see what his presidency would have been had he had actually been president for maybe 2 terms during the Progressive era and strikes and all that stuff happening. would Grover Cleveland have to deal with that? I don't know. It's a very interesting thought process to think about. But those would be I think the big, most notable things for the most part that Garfield, in some ways, would economically and policy-wise kind of be known for. He's an economic powerhouse who believes in, genuine freedom and equality for everyone, even minorities, which even back then it's kind of a winning combination. So it's not too bad, and okay, I can see why he could eventually become president. So Garfield liked Grant, I think, to an extent. I think I pretty much on a deeper personal level, I would probably say he got he got along better than the previous two presidents. So but then again, it's not that big of a stretch, or it's not that big of a bar to set for the most part. Excuse me. Grant, ultimately, ideologically speaking, was pretty similar to Garfield in a lot of ways, other than the actual financial issues, because I think Grant was a little obtuse when it comes to the economy and the economic health of the country in certain aspects. I think they differed on tariffs for the most part. And, Garfield was pretty hardline on tariffs for the most part. It's actually one of the things he's kind of known for. Actually, to be quite honest with you, he basically just really advocated towards more free trade. To be honest, so low tariffs, et cetera, and really just wanted things to allow cross seas, international waters. He's not naive to that. Basically, we need economic health for the entirety of the country. But it's a balancing act back and forth. Ultimately, though, he and Grant, black suffrage, were gonna help support that. They're both basically moderate Republicans by this particular point in time in 1869 to basically just the first term of Grant's presidency. And unfortunately for James A. Garfield, he's also not going to be, he will not escape the scandals that will encompass Ulysses S. Grant's presidency. As I previously stated before, Ulysses S. Grant's presidency culminated in a shit ton of scandals, pardon my language. Some that are, nothing burgers. Some that are like, oh, that's a staggering amount of money for that particular era. One of them was the Credit Mobiler scandal that unfortunately James A. Garfield is going to unfortunately be a part of. So if you don't know what that scandal is, effectively railroads are a thing, and there's the two big ones, Union Pacific, what was the other one? Central Pacific. And ultimately the government's going to invest in these railroads, and they're going to give out loans, etc., to build tracks for transcontinental railroad throughout the entirety of the country. Long story short, basically, for some particular reason, or somehow, I don't know how it slips past people, they based the Union Pacific and Pacific Central, or Central Pacific, ultimately give out a bill that's $15 million over budget that the taxpayers had to pay out, and it pissed off a lot of people. And it was found out, I think James G. Blaine, the big wig Republican, he's one of the other big, he's like the Ted Cruz of his era and time during this particular point in time. James G. Blaine himself is basically like, you're not going to smear my name, so we're going to throw everyone under the bus. And James A. Garfield ultimately is going to be one of the guys that's going to fall for it, because he ended up taking or receiving a loan of $330, which, let me make it very clear, this entire Credit Mobile scandal is really complicated. There's a couple biographies with differing looks at it. One biography is just straightforward, this is what happened. I can't confirm whether or not he was actually scandalously guilty, where it was very clear he's trying to get one up from under the people, et cetera, and take bribes and whatnot. I'm just gonna flat out say I don't think he did. Not necessarily because I didn't think politicians were corrupt back then. I think they were incredibly corrupt. But if you're gonna be corrupt for something a little more than $300, which around that time is maybe like $6,000. People do crazier things. Like he's a smart man, so even if he was corrupt, he's not that dumb to get caught with that level and amount of money. Anyways, he basically just says, "Yeah, I took it. Is that a problem?" And they're basically just like, yes, no. It's only $300. So he basically gets off, relatively speaking, scot-free. And everyone's like, hey, which sucks because I do want to point this out too, which they really go quickly with during Ulysses S. Grant's presidency, because it's really just more of the same, where he's voting party lines, moderate Republicans. He's worried about the midterm elections that are coming up in both of Grant's terms, where it's very clear that Grant, despite being himself very popular, the Republicans are starting to lose some steam. They're really losing steam. They're Democrats are getting a lot of power back. At one point, they will win a lot more seats in the House. I think they do take over one of the houses. I forgot. A lot of this is on the top of my head. But basically, this is going to be a very, very tricky time. He's very worried about the Republicans losing control of Congress for the most part. And it's not going to help that he's going to be, one of the big wigs responsible in electing and basically pushing forward what would be known as the salary grab of 1873. Basically increases the compensation for members of Congress by 50%, retroactively put in and used for 1871. So basically, if you're in Congress in 1873, boom, you just got paid, and Garfield was primarily responsible. And every single book is basically just like, yeah, he kind of did that. So that's a thing on his resume. It was unfortunate because it only made a lame duck Congress in 1872, 1873, eventually in 1874 when the midterm elections are going to come and make things even more difficult for Congress and the radical Republicans and just the Republicans in general. They would actually lose the majority in the House, and he'd actually lose his chairmanship, I believe, of the House Ways and Means Committee and a whole bunch of different committees, although he will become at this particular point in time the House Minority Leader. So gotta look on the bright side, you know what I'm saying? So, to sum it all up, his entire congressional career is really fascinating. It goes all over the place, to be quite honest with you. He's a young, rambunctious radical, and then by the end, or by near the end, really, once the election of 1876 comes along, he's a real seasoned vet. I mean, so much so that he might actually become the House Speaker if the Republicans ever gain control of the House effectively. That's how powerful he effectively is at this point, and how prominent he is at this point in terms of politics. His family is very proud of him. Obvious family struggles because he's always away. Always away a lot. He's gonna have a bunch of kids, and a lot of them are of teenage age by the time 1876 rolls around. Now, the Republican Party as a whole is really all over the place. The Democratic Party is slowly gaining steam as, they're trying to shed the image of, the party of slavery. And the Republican Party is really all over the place because there's good Republicans, but then there's also very complicated Republicans for the most part. And a lot of these guys, unfortunately, are part of scandals. In the entire Republican Party, for the most part, because of Ulysses S. Grant, for better or worse, ultimately it just has this weird shroud of scandals left and right throughout the entirety of the party, which really sucks and puts a damper on the midterm elections, which made the Republicans lose the House and made things very increasingly difficult for James A. Garfield. But he pushed through and he persevered. And he played his cards real close to the vest and ultimately stayed very close to Ulysses S. Grant and basically the entire Republican political sphere. I mean, he's basically one of the top three guys at this point, If Grant's like Trump, for instance, hypothetically speaking, in terms of stature, not in terms of actual character or anything like that, and then you got Blaine, who's like a Cruz, you got a Hawley, who's kind of like James A. Garfield, then you probably got like a Tom Cotton in like Rutherford B. Hayes, again in terms of stature, not actual character or anything like that, but that would be something though. I think that'd be very, very fascinating. You have to understand all this has happened too. This is very real life. These people like these Senate chambers and House chambers were actual real chambers that people conversed in, and all these things are actually happening. So don't think of this as just history, or that history won't repeat itself, or history won't repeat itself in a different way. It's a lot of corruption and a lot of confusing things happen within history, and I think people need to understand that fundamentally before they come to very interesting conclusions that things are what they are or aren't what they are. I guess what I'm trying to say is keep an open mind. Ultimately, is what I'm trying to say. Anyways. He's going to be a part of certain committees and certain things. Garfield himself became a leader, what would be known as the Waving in the Bloody Shirt campaign in 1876. The presidential election of 1876 was a contested one. Garfield basically just spends the next 2 years biding his time. Again, he has no aspirations for the presidency whatsoever. I should probably point that out. He does not want to become president. He's comfortable with the power that he has, the capability that he has. If anything, him becoming president just makes things much more murky for him. It ruins any ability for him to actually have, simple power for the most part without as much responsibility. And things become very difficult it's a contentious time within politics. The Democrats are trying to do a whole bunch of different things, and the Republicans and James A. Garfield are really, kind of rising the tensions, rising the fires and flames of division, as I previously noted in Rutherford B. Hayes' episode, partly Grant's episode. The country is still kind of like, we had just fought a civil war 10 years ago, and things are still really tense. They're still a little bit tender. Republicans are invading the South, and, Democrats are taking over New York. It's all over the place, really, and I think it's really interesting to think about it in that particular perspective. But 1876, the presidential election is on. I do not condone, personally, the use of inflammatory comments. The problem with politics sometimes is that people kind of just they wave a whole bunch of different things in your face, and if neither side did that, I think this world would be a better place. Personally, what I mean by this is, I think of today, for instance, where it's like, never forget how they stole this election from us. I'm talking about the 2016 one, and then the hypocritical nature of 2020, and then basically just both sides it's just continuing tensions, and it's only going to get worse and worse and worse from here. In this particular case, in 1876, I would argue in a lot of ways, the Republicans are kind of really stoking the fire for political division, ultimately, and Garfield's no stranger in any meaningful way against it for the most part. He's he's basically arguing in places, campaigning actively, reminding basically everybody the horrible treatment Union soldiers faced. Notably, in one particular case, he talks about the Andersonville, Georgia, inhumane treatment of Union prisoners led to war crimes, to the camp's commander, this guy named Henry Witz, who was executed actually in November of 1865. Anyways, that story is actually really interesting. It's pretty brutal. A lot of the horrible treatment a lot of Union soldiers faced during that particular point in time. He's basically reminding them constantly, hey, this is what happened. These are the same people, and personally, I'm kind of like, bruh, come on. But at the same time, it's like, it's effective as hell. Because the Republicans, in my personal view, had no shot prior to this. Samuel J. Tilden, I believe it was Tilden. I might be getting sorry, I might be getting my people mixed. Nope, it is Tilden. Sorry. I don't know why I'm having brain farts right now, but ultimately, Tilden himself was just, he's not that, effectively. He's a New Yorker who just happens to be a Democrat and wants to go against the Republican machine, And he's popular, is ultimately what I'm getting at, what I'm trying to say, versus Rutherford B. Hayes, who's really only known in Ohio, who ends up becoming the compromise candidate for the Republican Party. Point being, though, ultimately, especially since James A. Garfield did not want to become president, that's how the campaign was, and they've really pushed hard for that specific campaign, creating a lot of divisiveness, and you think tensions are crazy now. I would say they are just as crazy as they were back in 1876 during that particular election. I would also like to point out too, when the election goes into chaos and there's contested states, etc., guess who's on the committee to actually try and figure out who actually won this committee? The 15-man committee who will decide who will become president. James A. Garfield himself. Yes, nothing really special, to be quite honest with you. Some of the books will say that he's not long and hard, but ultimately it's like, come on, he's gonna vote Republican. Okay, there's no argument against it ultimately, and he ended up voting Republican, and then Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president, and then he will basically be, the leader of the House during the Hayes administration. Da da da.